So, hello everyone, welcome to this opening lecture for the Master of Migration Studies. We are delighted to have you all here. My name is Juan Carlos Triviño. I'm a professor in the Master. I'm responsible for the course on methodological research seminars. I'm also a research fellow at the Barcelona Institute of International Studies. So today we have our guest speaker, Lucy Mayblin. Thank you very much for accepting our invitation to speak with us today. But before giving the floor to Lorenzo Gabrieli, who will be moderating this session, and Lucy, I would like to present a little bit the course that I'm responsible for and where this opening lecture occurs in the framework of this course. So, as I said before, I'm responsible for the course on methodological research seminars. This course is intended to give you the building blocks for writing your master's thesis. The course is designed in a way that you have the experience of having exchanges with well-known scholars in the field, practitioners in the field. And at the same time, you have also some research-oriented sessions with two professors, myself and the professor Robert Templer. On the part that I'm responsible for, which are these working sessions that basically we give you some tools to develop your master thesis, we have in total 6 sessions. 4 sessions that are research-oriented and 2 sessions that are more policy-oriented. The 2 sessions that are policy-oriented, this is the responsibility of Professor Robert Templer, where he will basically share with you his knowledge on how the world of international organizations working on migration, how they work, what is the type of policy documents that are used in this context. Well, on my side, I will be teaching the research-oriented sessions. And these sessions, they will be devoted to questions like, what are the different elements that a master thesis has, how to find information for your master thesis, where to go when you are in need of certain sort of information that might be useful for your master thesis, ethics in research, and also we will cover the research policy nexus. So these are like the different aspects that we will be discussing in this session. As you may have seen in the syllabus, the sessions all of them are mandatory. This is a central component of the master. And if you have any questions, if you have any comments, please feel free to drop a line by email. If you want to meet in person, I'm more than happy to do so. And with no further ado, I give the floor to Lorenzo, and thank you again for being here.
Thank you very much, Juan Carlos. Nice to meet you all. Welcome at this first session of the master seminars. I'm very happy to introduce Lucy Mayblin, our guest today. It's a pity she's just online and not present here, but I think we are used in the last year to have this kind of virtual meeting, so it's not so strange anymore. I'm very happy also because I think as the topic of today is quite central and not so usual in migration study. The title of our presentation will be Understanding Contemporary Migration and Border Controls in the Context of Colonial History. And I think is another step in something that for me is very central and changing the focus on migration phenomena and on migrant, and is leaving a little bit, at least, the Eurocentrism that pervade our look, and trying to switch the view from the migrants, the newcomer, the others, to the reception context to Europe, and look at the historical part of Europe, before receiving this recent migration, and so enlarging the historical, the time frame of analysis, and looking at colonial history. That's this phantom, this elephant in the room is always there, but it's very difficult to talk about. And there's a proof of the recent problems faced by scholars in France, for example, studying process of racialization that are more or less persecuted by French government. So I think this underline that's a very sensitive issue, but it's also very central in analytic terms. So looking at colonial history and linking colonial history to migration processes, not just in terms of migration path, saying that, okay, former colonies are related and in terms of migration path to old metropolitan countries, but also looking a little bit more in depth on how European society are framing and producing the others, how they are, how does this historical colonial legacy is working in the othering processes, and in particularly, I think, also in terms of racialization. I will not speak more for the moment, and I will let the floor to Lucy. Just a short introduction. Lucy is, she has studied human geography and European politics, and his PhD was in sociology. She considers herself a political sociologist, as she explained in a wonderful website. That's lucymayblin.com if you want to check for more publication and current research. She's senior lecturer in sociology at University of Sheffield, and her research focuses on asylum, human rights, policy making, and legacy of colonialism. She has published extensively in journals and books. Three main books I want to underline. The first one is 2017, Asylum After Empire. The second one is Impoverishment and Asylum, and the third one was edited in 2021, just this year, Migration Studies and Colonialism. I will underline more things, very interesting things for bio, but you can check it in the website. I think it's better. I let the floor to you, Lucy, and thank you for being here with us.
Thank you so much for inviting me to this talk, and I'm really sorry that I can't be with you in person and kind of be in the room with you. I have got some slides. I think the function of Zoom is that I will have to share my whole screen, and my slides are not, they're just indicative of things that I'm saying. They're not very essential. So I don't mind not sharing them, or I don't know if you can make the screen show the slides and my face. But anyway, feel free to turn the slides off if it's more difficult to understand without seeing my face, or I don't know. The politics of the online presentation are tricky, I think. So I'm just going to try and share the correct screen, and hopefully it will work. Can you see my slides?
Yes.
Yeah. Now I have lost my, okay, I'll just do it this way. I printed my talk as well, because I didn't know what would happen on the screen on the different platforms. It's always different. Okay, so I'm going to start with an observation, and that's that the history of migration globally is very much entangled with colonialism. So between 1600 and 1950, the vast majority of voluntarily mobile people...
Lucy, excuse me. We cannot see your slides yet.
Oh, you can't see my slides?
No.
Does it show now?
Oh, now we can see it. Yes.
Okay.
I'm sorry.
It's not a very exciting or important slide, to be honest, but okay. So between 1600 and 1950, the vast majority of voluntarily mobile people originated in Europe and sought their fortunes on other continents. An estimated 62 million people moved around European empires in the period 1800 to 1950, They were settlers, laborers, colonials, imperialists, and invaders. Then there were the massive forced migrations of the triangular slave trade and circuits of indenture, from the large-scale population displacements which decolonization gave rise to the movement of people from the former colonies to the former metropoles in the late 20th century. Colonialism was all about people on the move. It should be unsurprising to us then that patterns of mobility and immobility today follow these colonial era logics in what Stefan and Mao and colleagues have called the global mobility divide, or that border regimes effectively amount to multilateral projects for the regional containment of third world persons beyond the first world, as Tendai Achiumi has argued. And yet, as you may have noticed in your studies already, when we consult in the indexes of migration studies textbooks today, it's strangely rare to find any mention of colonialism, post-colonialism, or decolonization. And until recently, there's been a general lack of interest in the legacies and continuities of colonialism for contemporary migration governance and the experiences of migrants and hosts today. The book Migration Studies and Colonialism that I wrote with Joe Turner set out in part to address this. We start from the premise that colonial history should be central to migration studies, and we argue that colonialism is fundamental to contemporary migrations, mobilities, immobilities, receptions, and social dynamics, and that this is something we should all be alive to. It affects everyone, not only those who are most disadvantaged by migration regimes. Our aim is to explore what it would mean to take seriously the centering of colonialism in migration research, not through forging new theories developed by us, but through learning from and being inspired by the wealth of literature that already exists in the world to engage with this task. Because there's actually quite a lot of literature out there. Actually, it just doesn't, or didn't at the time of writing, seem to have penetrated very far into migration studies, and I suspect this is something that's changing as we speak. We didn't actually originally expect to be giving talks on the book because it isn't a research monograph, it's a kind of high-level textbook, so you are a very suitable audience perhaps, but we wrote it partly out of a frustration that post-colonial and decolonial perspectives, amongst others, seemed very peripheral to migration studies in the UK and Europe particularly, and partly because we got asked a lot for reading lists from people, especially PhD students and master's students, who were interested in these literatures but unsure where to start. They often had supervisors who were not familiar with the literatures themselves. So the book was a sort of answer to that question, a way really to platform work and ideas that we think should be essential reading for migration studies courses. It's a set of ideas that we think are just really interesting and productive to think with. So the book mentions our work, but mainly deals with the work of others, which is why we didn't really expect to be presenting on it originally. But having been invited to talk about it quite a lot, we decided to develop this talk and continue to make the case for centering colonialism and migration studies. But we aren't representing ourselves as the inventors of this argument or the center of this literature. Our aim in the book wasn't to spend endless pages critiquing migration studies as it's articulated in hegemonic journals, conferences, policy fora, and textbooks in the global north. And this is something that we have been criticized for. People want a lot more of the critique. But we really wanted to produce something positive and productive, not something that's primarily critical. And we deleted many, many pages of critique in the process of trying to force ourselves to do that, to be more positive and giving ideas and fruit for thought rather than criticizing other people. We don't, though, present a new grand theory, or claim that every single thing that people might want to research can be explained with reference to colonialism. And many of the perspectives discussed contradict and contest each other. And there are also, of course, undeveloped areas of work and gaps in the literature. And we didn't really want to smooth over contestations and contradictions. We weren't looking to resolve these diverse literatures into a single grand theory, But there are also a lot of commonalities and confluences which you think are really productive to think with. And I will be really interested to hear if any of this resonates with the Spanish case particularly. So, will my slide change? There we go. In this talk, I'm going to focus on two key themes that we identify in the book, which are central in incorporating colonialism into an analysis of the present. They are the critique of modernity and the ongoing racial logics of colonialism. So let's start with the critique of modernity, which is something that we see across post-colonial and decolonial theory. Broadly speaking, it's really central to those theoretical agendas. Modernity, which you may have come across at various points in your studies, is a key orienting concept in the social sciences within many universities globally. For most academic scholars, modernity is a relatively uncontroversial and useful shorthand. It refers to a series of events which occurred in Europe between the 17th and 19th centuries, events which fundamentally changed European societies forever. Anthony Giddens in sociology, for example, explains that modernity refers to, quote, modes of social life or organization which emerged in Europe from about the 17th century onwards and which subsequently became more or less worldwide in their influence. And that might include things like the emergence of capitalism and democracy and human rights. So this generality, he notes, leaves the exact content of modernity and its effects open for discussion, but two things, when and where it emerged, are generally undisputed. So, colonial expansion led to the proliferation of forms of knowledge for making sense of the world, as well as ways of organizing this knowledge. And modernity was one frame through which to do this. As the social sciences developed through the 19th and 20th centuries, the divisions between the disciplines often followed colonial modes of thinking about the world in relation to modern societies and conversely traditional societies. And Gaminda Bambra writes really well on this, and I do recommend her 2007 book for an elaboration of what I'm about to say. So, for example, sociology has tended to deal with modern societies and the conditions of living in modernity, while anthropology and human geography originally dealt with what came to be thought of as traditional societies and so-called primitive peoples. Disciplines like political science and economics started from the position of understanding politics as a Western phenomenon, usually starting in ancient Greece, or the capitalist economy as a product of European modernity, and then later expanded out from this geographical starting point to be universalized. This narrative of modernity then has both explicitly preoccupied many social scientists and implicitly provided the underlying framework from which the world is today understood. In other words, the world is often automatically thought of as comprised of modern and traditional, developed and developing societies. For migration studies, this dichotomous way of construing the world, distinguishing between developed and developing countries, or more recently, the global north and the global south, has been really important, obviously. And I'm sure you can see how many of us just routinely think in these kinds of terms when we conceptualize the world. Post-colonial and decolonial scholars argue that this narrative of modernity is centrally a concept rooted in the project of European and later Western self-understanding, which went hand in hand with colonial expansion. Understanding how some societies came to be modern and superior in relation to others who were understood as traditional and inferior is central to post-colonial and decolonial thought. But for scholars in these fields, the key thing is denaturalizing and problematizing the categorizations of the world in relation to places which are modern and those which are not. So to put it another way, post-colonial and decolonial scholars are interested in exploring how this narrative has played a fundamental role in shaping scientific knowledge and dominant understandings of the world system, and also in critiquing and problematizing its uses and effects. Central to understanding the critique of modernity provided by post-colonial and decolonial scholars are the vectors of time and space. The temporal aspect of modernity, its arrival, is usually thought of as occurring within the context of a linear conception of time and progress, which originated with the Enlightenment. So in the words of Walter Mignolo, the present was described as modern and civilized, the past as traditional and barbarian. The more you go towards the past, the closer you get to nature. The point here is to start seeing this as one way of thinking about the world over time, but it's not the only way, and it's not necessarily unproblematic. Europe is often understood as having progressed from nature through tradition to enlightenment, while others did not. But because progress towards modernity occurs within a linear conception of time, Europe and the global north, which is a shorthand for the metropoles and the settler colonies, will always be ahead. If others accelerate, they may catch up. So achievement of modernity is a kind of long drawn out race. Walter Mignolo draws our attention to the fact that in the first centuries of colonialism, the difference between colonial conqueror and the objects of conquest was articulated in terms of barbarism. Others were barbarians. With the development through the Enlightenment following Hegel with ideas of linear time and thus progress from barbarianism, barbarians became primitives. Primitives are still barbarians, but they're very specifically defined in temporal terms as being of the past and capable of change through enlightenment and civilization into the future. This is clearly a colonial discourse, which makes sense primarily from the perspective of the colonizer. But over time and into the present, the concept of linear time has facilitated the classification of cultural differences according to their proximity to either modernity, which represents the future and the present, or tradition, which represents the past. But we know from Edward Said, places elsewhere from the Western Academy only exist in these ways to the extent that Occidentals understand them as such. The Orient exists only in the minds and works of Occidentals. Spatially, as Homi Bhabha, but also Gominda Bambra and others have argued, modernity first emerged in Europe as a way of making sense of perceived changes that were happening there in relation to elsewhere. The self-conception of Europeans as modern, therefore, depends on the conceptualization of other places as not modern. Of course, a lot of this development was not endogenously produced. It depended on huge revenues from the slave trade and the use of slave and indentured labor, on revenues from colonial taxation, on the subjugation of colonized people, industries, and lands. So colonialism and coloniality, which is a colonial mindset and worldview, went hand in hand with the emergence of this idea of modernity. As Annabel Cajano explains, modernity was colonial from its point of departure. Capitalism, for example, didn't endogenously emerge in Europe as a consequence of Enlightenment, rationalism, and industrial development. Rather, slavery and colonialism produced a concentration of wealth in European societies, which funded the Industrial Revolution, allowed for global trading dominance, and also offered technological inspiration for the emerging industries. The emergence of capitalism is first and foremost a global colonial story, a story of racism and differentiation, despite the seductive power of the story of inherent European brilliance. The point really here is that modernity is an idea or a framework, a way of making sense of the world, not a given fact. So who and where can be modern changes over time. And this is also intermeshed with ideas of racial inclusion and differentiation, because modernity has a racial content rooted in colonialism. Coloniality is at all times imbued with a racial sorting logic. For example, Irish people are now generally considered to be modern and white, and Finns are more modern and more white than Russians through joining the European Union, where previously both nations were thought of as non-modern and racially inferior to whiteness. These common sense logics of inclusion and differentiation aren't rational, but they do appear rational to many people, including academic researchers. But thinking with modernity draws our attention to the ways in which whiteness, Europeanness, Christianity, and the West, etc., occupy a semantic field with shifting emphases. As Homi Bhabha, Gayatri Spivak, Edward Said, and countless others teachers, this racial sorting logic is both biological and cultural. The location of culture, as Bhabha puts it, of civilization and knowledge and sophistication is spatialized along geographies which map onto the geographies of colonialism. So hopefully you can see how thinking with this critique of the narrative of modernity opens up new ways of thinking about migration, not only as a phenomenon, but centrally various people's reactions to and ways of understanding it. Where discussions of modernity find their most immediate and obvious application in migration studies is in the field of migration and development, possibly. There's debate about whether development increases rates of migration through providing people with the financial means to migrate, or whether it allows them to stay in their particular countries of origin as a wider range of jobs and opportunities open up. But as Parvati Raghuram has pointed out, almost all theorizations of this link assume migration to be something that can be contained, regulated, or influenced, and development as normatively good. For these, few of these perspectives challenge the idea of development itself as a problematic colonial framework, which makes a range of assumptions about the modernity and enlightenment of a given group of people, while ignoring the wider structural conditions which create poverty. So the discourse of modernity has been given a range of rolling conceptual proxies which give us a language through which we might express how modern a part of the world is. In English, these include the first world, the second world, the third world, developed and developing, global north, global south, the west, the east, the occident, the orient. And rather than arguing that one of these typologies is better or more geographically accurate and should therefore be viewed as superior to others, we understand all of these labels as shifting symbolic geographies, which rarely map onto actual places. These kinds of labels only make sense in relation to each other. And sometimes we want to use them for particular political reasons or to make a particular point. And sometimes we use them unthinkingly. The labels are deployed by different people as necessary conceptual generalizations to help them and us articulate particular ideas about the world and the various people and places in it. They hold social and political meaning, but they shouldn't be mistaken for real or fixed places. And we must be alive to the logics and legacies of colonial modernity contained within them, and that includes within our scholarship. Okay. So in the previous part of my talk, I briefly introduced the critique of modernity, which is really trying to, sorry, my children are having a really loud argument. Hopefully it's going to die down. Yes, it's died down. Okay. So in the previous part of the talk, I briefly introduced the critique of modernity, which is really trying to help us unthink the givens of what we know. So just hold that with you. If we can hold that with us in this section, I'm going to introduce the theme of race and racism and how that's also tied up with colonialism and with ideas of modernity. So when I'm talking about racism, I'm not primarily talking about unkind deeds and bad words or at the level of the individual, though of course racism does occur at those levels. Racism is a system, a mode of domination, and a form of power. As a mode of domination, it persists despite scientific developments that have proven racial categories to be largely meaningless and racial hierarchies to be fabrications. And yet ideas about different races hold meaning for many people around the world. And of course, racism is an enduring structural force in the contemporary moment. Recognizing that race is a social construct doesn't mean that it doesn't have material consequences, shape political and economic structures and everyday experiences, nor does it mean that the histories and power of race and racialization should be ignored by researchers. And it's a kind of curious situation that migration studies has tended to shy away from thinking about racism. What we learn from the vast and rich body of work that's researched and theorized race and racism is that while understandings of race present it as shifting, contingent, localized, and multivariate, it can't be understood outside of histories of modern colonialism. For over 500 years, European colonial and imperial expansion fundamentally reshaped the organization of global social relations. That included economic production, wealth, industrialization, and human relationships with the natural world. And through the emergence of colonial scientific thought, it also shaped how we know the world. European colonial projects, whilst localized and varied, depended on the subjugation, both material and symbolic, of the Americas, Africa, and Asia and its peoples and cultures. This is sometimes narrated in Western history as a series of benign discoveries, but colonial expansion, territorial acquisition, and accumulation were premised on dispossessive, genocidal, and dehumanizing violence. Warfare, disease, and outright murder underpinned this process of invasion, territorial acquisition, and extraction. And this, of course, occurred in the face of mass resistance from colonized and indigenous populations who fought and pushed back against domination and subjugation. At the same time, the material extraction from colonization shaped the conditions for industrialization in Europe. Not only did the non-European world suffer violent turmoil, this also involved the inclusion and subjugation of colonized subjects within an imperial capitalist system that was manufactured to benefit the colonizers, and later, of course, the Allied settler and Allied capitalist regimes. And this has continued long after the end of formal colonialism. It's embedded in the structural dynamics of today's global economy. What colonial expansion did is reorganize global relations around European capitalist modes of exploitation, labor relations, private property, and relations of intimacy and reproduction. Central to this was the deployment of race as a means of organizing and legitimizing colonialism. So race was used as a way of categorizing people in a taxonomy of humanity, as Sylvia Wynter, amongst others, have taught us. It was about understanding people as more or less human. Race shaped patterns of who was colonized and how people were treated and brought into colonial projects, for example, as laborers, slaves, or populations to be eradicated. The invention of race involved organizing human beings into a hierarchy connoting inferiority and superiority, and this intensified in the 18th century, where physical traits such as skin color took on particular social meanings, alongside cultural traits and religion to code people into this hierarchy. The idea of a common humanity born out of the Enlightenment actually relied on the denial of colonized people from inclusion in this common humanity. It was Europeans who possessed reason and history, while lands primed for colonial conquest were viewed as without history, as empty spaces or merely places of savagery or barbarism. For Voltaire, people racialized as Black were heathens and imbeciles. For Locke, indigenous Americans were nothing but wild, savage beasts. For Rousseau, Aboriginal people were untouched by politics and history. The rational sciences of the Enlightenment would then go on to, they claimed, discover the realities and objective evidence of racial categories and differences through the disciplines of biology, anthropology, and phrenology. Non-somatic traits, so non-bodily traits, were steadily coded into these classifications, as I mentioned earlier, and into ideas of who could be part of humanity and who was deficient, unworthy, or in a state of infancy. In this European perspective, people became placed in a temporality of modernity as either stuck in the past or progressing towards modernity. This temporality of development almost entirely approximated with those populations who were being colonized or would be colonized and slowly incorporated into a global system. So you can see the connection here between ideas of modernity and ideas of race, and this was far from rhetorical or symbolic. For example, when the French Revolution was made in the name of liberty, equality, fraternity, Black Africans enslaved by the French in the West Indies and the Indian Ocean were actively denied such rights. Resistance against the racialized contradictions of the French Revolution then inspired the Haitian Revolution, which began as a mass slave revolt in 1871 and ended with a far more radical model of social coexistence than it actually emerged in France, but it seems to have been actively forgotten in Europe. What I'm illustrating here is that race was not just a series of prejudices. It became an organizing principle on a global scale through colonial encounters and was turned into a criterion of social classification for world populations and systems of labor. This meant, in the first place, new social identities were produced all over the world. Strategies of racial classifications described the physical traits of people as external manifestations of their apparent racial nature. Racial schemas then always privileged whiteness and Europeanness, but were and are not only propagated by white people or colonizers alone. Just as with ideas of modernity and notions of temporality, some colonized peoples have historically bought into this schema of modernity and race, and so too have many post-colonial states become imbricated within it. So race not only legitimated the subordination of non-Europeans, but also provided a system of knowledge through which Europeans discovered their own whiteness and their imagined superiority as modern people. In this way, race also shaped the organization of social relations, identities, and systems of labor in European metropoles. European society became understood as the home of modernity, rationality, objectivity, and whiteness. Against this, other societies were discovered as pre-modern, backward, savage, and outside of whiteness. So European publics began to imagine themselves as white and superior, and this also structured class and gendered relations in the metropoles. So these broad-based discussions of colonialism, race, and modernity are highly pertinent to migration studies. To consider the movement internationally as somehow separate from ideas and race and modernity is to undervalue how the control of movement and the construction of borders has historically been racialized, and how this continues to shape our present. Who could move where and for what purpose, under what conditions, was central to the organization of colonial rule. Empires were also racial projects, as I've discussed, and this was exemplified in the control of movement. So the control of movement was a key tool in the suppression in the suppression of indigenous populations under settler colonialism, for example, through enclosure, the imposition of European rules of private property and contractual law, the erection of boundaries of razor wire, reserves, and systems of camps and categories of tribal membership. Some of these things continue today. Being attuned to the continued social significance of race is to be attuned to the historical continuities and legacies of empire. Colonialism may have formally ended in many, but certainly not all places, but as the power structures that dominate global politics remain broadly unchanged from the heyday of European empires. And in this way, we need to understand how contemporary mobility from the global south, whether south-south or south-north, is already embedded in what De Silva and Chakrabarty call the colonial racial matrix, which includes the capitalist accumulation of land, exploitation of labor, and the appropriation of resources, all of which have underpinned modernity. And analytics of race in this sense helps us to understand how mobility and the treatment of migrants is connected across the levels of the macro, the meso, and the micro. By exploring the relationship between movement, colonialism, and race, we might identify, for example, the slave trade as a period of sustained forced displacement. Between 1950 and 1820, African slaves forcibly moved to the New World outnumbered the movement of Europeans 4-1. This created networks of transportation and mobility that laced together the Atlantic economy with the Mediterranean and West Africa, from Lagos to Bristol to Charleston. Migration studies scholars tend to focus on the internal histories of Europe, such as the control of vagabonds, for a history of borders and immigration control. And yet, as Simone Brown, whose amazing 2015 book I recommend to everybody, as she powerfully demonstrates, slavery was itself a system of mobility that shaped future projects of immigration. Enslaved people were sorted and categorized at transatlantic ports, inspected and documented in a manner that preceded and shaped the invention of paper documentation and the passport. In the plantation economy, whether in the Caribbean or North America, enslaved people were unable to move off a master's property without a slave pass, which identified them as somebody's property. Slave hunters, wanted posters and branding all regulated movement around racial categories and limited free movement, Brown argues. This was organized around often explicit and gratuitous racialized violence. In the 19th century Georgia, for example, any Black person found without the correct documentation by a white person could be subject to lashings. When enslaved people originally moved to the Americas, this was as chattel on slave ships. And this is very different from how most white Europeans moved across empires. Christina Sharp talks of the horrors of the ship's hold in the Middle Passage, the dehumanizing cramped conditions, manacled, torn from kinship, family, and community. Disease was rife. Enslaved people were frequently drowned, both accidentally and on purpose, and records show that captors often threw enslaved people overboard in stormy weather if the ship was overloaded or to avoid capture after the abolition of the slave trade. The slave trade, we should remember, was always premised on the active resistance and survival of people racialized as Black who fought against the system to escape, to protect others, to maintain traditions, and in places like Haiti to instantiate a revolution. Whilst the movement of white settlers, migrants, laborers, and traders across the Atlantic was, of course, fraught with danger, they weren't subject to the same dehumanizing conditions, violence, and death. Instead, the passage of European passengers was oriented towards sustaining and protecting their life as customers, citizens, settlers, or laborers, even if class and gender continued to structure those experiences differently. Writing of the contemporary crisis of immobility in the Mediterranean, P. Khalil Saucier and Tyrone Woods remind us that the drowning and avoidable deaths of people moving from Africa today has a historical precedent in the Middle Passage in Europe's organization of the slave trade. And here they're not saying that irregular crossings in the Mediterranean and the lack of care for their lives is the same as the slave trade. What they're saying is that the lack of concern, even the mortal endangerment of people crossing the Mediterranean, points to a dehumanization, a devaluation of lives, which is akin to the devaluation and dehumanization of Black lives during the 18th and 19th centuries. But after the abolition of slavery, capitalist and imperial authorities drew on indentured laborers as a means of creating a pool of cheap labor in settler and European colonies. So this instantiates like a new wave of movement around the world. And it resulted in large-scale forced migration from India and China particularly. So indentured laborers traveled under slave-like conditions and worked under contracts which often left them destitute. Significantly, as Radhika Mongia argues, throughout the 19th century, the control of indentured laborers would result in the establishment and centralization of many of the border practices we are familiar with today. And here it's worth noting that it's not only how we conceptualize movement that's based on colonial knowledge, or that systems of global racism and inequality create the conditions for movement. Borders themselves were part of the architecture of empires. So port inspections, both on departure and arrival, expanded in this period to monitor laborers for disease and for correct documentation. The role of border officials was created to track this movement. Private companies, ticket sellers, and ships' captains were also expected to monitor who was arriving. This equally drew upon and reinforced laws against vagabonds that were drawn up in Europe but then experimented with in the colonies. In this context, colonial bordering was not only about containment, but also about forced mobility, where indentured laborers could be viewed as both an economic necessity and as a social risk. For example, in settler colonies such as the United States, South Africa, and Australia, the influx of Asian labor was often viewed as a threat to the social sexual order of white supremacy and white nationalism. So Black and brown men were often also viewed as sexual threats preying on white women. In the British Empire, even if all subjects had a formal right to travel across empire, in theory, this was shaped This was in fact shaped by contingent practices of control, emergent forms of border bureaucracy, and informal forms of management. So in this context, internal and external borders were created to control racialized laborers. In work camps, through pass systems, through imprisonment and deportation, and in practices of disease control and quarantine. Borders emerged to police movement across empire and were tied to questions over the settlement, rights, and personhood of those moving subjects. And in this way, borders were, from their inception, focused on the racialized character of movement. And borders emerged as a means of control because of the ongoing resistance of colonized peoples and the push to escape and develop anti-colonial alternatives. Settler colonial states in the late 1800s began to formalize and institutionalize immigration and citizenship law more rigorously around race, inventing as they did new categories of person. And the global system of race that underpinned global capital was captured in white nationalist moves to control who could settle in particular countries. The 1870 Chinese Act in the United States, for example, banned the movement of Chinese laborers. In the 1880s, Australian federal states began to erect the white-only immigration policy that would dominate the 20th century up to 1968. And this was because, as elites argued, Asians were not suited to the Australian way of life. This was soon followed by South Africa, which drafted immigration law as it produced categories of race which would also structure apartheid. Ultimately, these moves reflect the transposition of what W.E.B. Du Bois called the colonial colour line into formal immigration policy within nation states. And Mongia argues that the very structure of citizenship, so central to the modern nation state itself, was invented to stratify the movement and rights of people across empires. Importantly, this wasn't solely a project of settler colonies. Metropoles like Britain, France, and the Netherlands formalized the divisions of the colour line in their citizenship and immigration laws and in imperial practices of movement. And this was institutionalized through the 20th century in the growth of immigration laws across European states, as well as in informal practices of exclusion in housing, labour market access, and policing. This culminated in moves to deny rights of citizenship and settlement to those colonised citizens who were racialised as non-white and had previously had, at least in theory, equal access to movement within empires. And it included those who were encouraged to move after formal decolonisation. So, rather than viewing borders as a product of the nation state, a political project separate from or counter to European colonialism, the scholars whose work we discuss in the book would see borders and immigration law as central to the function of colonial and imperial projects. And rather than suddenly ending, we can see these kinds of logics at work today. Contemporary systems of containment, visa policies, no-fly rules, refugee camps, and more structure the mobility and immobility of people globally, reworking categories of race. The letting die of people in various seas and deserts and mountains, the imprisonment of people who save others from drowning, the encampment and detention of racialized populations for crimes of movement, even people with legitimate claims for asylum under international law. The sheer frictionfulness of moving around the world if you have an Eritrean, Pakistani, or Ecuadorian passport compared to if you have a British, Australian, or Spanish passport. The costs and difficulties in obtaining a visa, the stops at airports, the extra checks, the criminalization, it follows old patterns of global mobility control, which are impossible, I think, to ignore. At the same time that racism allows for spectacular violence, such as purposefully allowing people to drown in the Mediterranean, these forms of necropolitics are also structural, done quietly and conducted through institutional processes and technical procedures, which are far from exceptional or overtly violent. The point here is that racialized violence is not always spectacle, but is also often technocratic, structural, and everyday. Enacted through, for example, regimes of waiting in detention centres, in refugee camps, through housing and labour policies, through resettlement schemes, deportation, integration strategies, and the inclusions and exclusions of the welfare state. The mundaneness of distinction and harm and its technicality doesn't stop it being arranged by understandings of race or understandings of human difference from colonialism, or from it being any less harmful. So to help us consider the impact of these histories, we argue in the book that there are at least 3 ways that we should think about migration, or we could think about migration and the importance of colonialism. The first point to highlight is the structural and racialized conditions of movement. Colonialism shaped who could move to where and under what conditions. It structured, for example, who was a passenger on a ship versus who was a captive as an enslaved person in the hold. Enforced mobility led, as it does today, to the transformation of societies left behind and arrived at. So we need to understand this when we explore contemporary movement. And at the same time, colonialism also created and continues to create networks of people, trade, and goods. European empires created lines of dependencies, economic as well as intimate relations of language, kinship, and culture that were global in reach and are reinforced under today's global economy. In light of this, we need to understand how people continued to move along such imperial grooves, as Stuart Hall called them. A basic example of this might be people traveling to Spain because they speak the imperial language of Spanish, or because of kinship ties, or because of histories of exploitation and dispossession that make movement necessary. So we need to ground any understanding of movement today in these historical and material linkages, structures, and connections to make real sense of migration. The second point of significance, we think, or way that we could approach this, is through the material history of immigration regimes and borders. We need to understand how the tools used to police mobility that continue to expand and proliferate today were created and arranged to control racialized mobility in a colonial world. Borders and the emergence of immigration practices have from their inception been attuned to the active dehumanization, surveillance, and control of particular colonized populations. This was their express purpose. Borders are and always have been oriented towards blocking the movement of some and not others. But this isn't merely an economic calculus. Despite the role racial differentiation plays in the structures of capitalism, of course, borders aren't oriented towards merely stopping racialized mobility, but borders reproduce hierarchies of race by distinguishing who can move and who cannot, and function as a sorting mechanism which creates ideas of worth, as well as replicating historical constructions of human value. I am coming towards the end now. So the third point is that it's not only through policies, laws, and violent bordering practices that we can observe the legacies of colonialism. It's also, as Stuart Hall so powerfully demonstrated across his life's work, through cultural products, discourses, and practices. Not all of this is negative. Of course, we can see connected histories and encounters in the emergence of hybrid cuisines, music, subcultures, and dialects. In spite of logics of distinction and difference, people mix. But at the same time, media and other apparently banal cultural representations which form the background to people's everyday lives of people on the move, and you can think of images you've seen on the news, and the responses of host communities to them are all saturated with historically grounded ideas, assumptions, and connotations which establish difference as self-evident and natural. In this way, racism doesn't only invoke somatic, so bodily traits, but also ideas around cultural difference as essentialized distinctions between different people. And I think nationalism needs to be seen through this lens. Ideas of cultural difference are often connected also to particular territories where particular national populations are seen to have supreme claims to be at home or native, casting others as out of place. And religion has, of course, been a reoccurring means of making these kinds of distinctions in different contexts over time. Everyday and naturalized claims to cultural difference are imbued with the logics of colonial civilizational difference, which often rework and emulate ideas about inferior and superior forms of culture, community, and the worth of certain subjects and societies over others. The vital point really is that colonialism is not just of the past, but structures our contemporary moment in a variety of ways, and this has particular salience for people who study migration. The very construction of the notion of migration and the political processes that are involved in making someone a migrant have been fundamentally shaped by colonialism in many places. Equally, ideas about human worth and cultural difference that shape current debates about migration are so often tied to the invention of race under empire. And I've, of course, only really been able to touch on some of these ideas, histories, and connections that we discuss in the book, in this talk. It's always hard to squeeze a whole book into a talk. And I'm sure that there's a lot missing also from the book, not just from my talk today, but I'd welcome any questions or thoughts that you have on these themes and reflections that you have on whether they resonate with the work that you're doing and the things that you're interested in. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Lucy.
It's always a relief to, after an online talk, to see that there are still people there, because you're just speaking.
Yeah, don't
into
worry,
the
room is full and the
people are
public
still
was
here.
very
You can hear
attentive.
me. And I apologize, I don't know, one of my children came in and was around. I don't know, hope it didn't cause any disturbance on the sound. I got rid of him.
Don't worry at all, Lucy, for this. Thank you very much. I think as your presentation is an excellent tool to decolonize or to start decolonizing or to trying to decolonize our Eurocentric ontology, epistemology, and methodologies. And in studying migration, I think is more important probably than in other disciplines. I have some questions and comments, but I prefer first to open the floor to the public. So feel free to ask and comment to Lucy. I don't know if you are able to see the room, Lucy, or not. No, not yet. I don't know if technically possible. Or yeah, okay, that's perfect. Yeah, now you can see the room also, Lucy.
Maybe a good way also to introduce some professors this is Dear Gebhardt also.
I'm going to sing a song. No, that would be nice. Thank you, Lucy, for your talk. Should I stand up? Yes. Which was very inspiring. And I struggle with one thing, and which is a bit about a political kind of conclusions of what you said, and I wonder also about the. So I just start and, and speak. When you say that, or I got the impression that you say that the function of borders hasn't much changed since colonial times, and I try to teach that in a different way, and I actually did that last week, telling my students that the Chinese Exclusion Act that you mentioned was one of the first projects to say, okay, this type of people cannot come here, with the idea to show how the function of border or the project of borders gets more and more, or gets, well, of impermeable borders and of selectiveness of borders gets more and more developed over time up to our present, and all the technologies linked to it that are, of course, much more sophisticated today. So I wonder whether this point of similarity between colonial times and our present, whether that doesn't make it more difficult to formulate a political critique of today's border regimes. No, that's a bit the point I'm struggling with. But it's a very, I mean, it's a very interesting thought, and maybe you can comment on how you see that. Thank you.
Thank you, Dirk. Lucy, do you want some other questions?
I think we still have an hour. I think we can start answering question by question if you want, Lucy, and then grouping maybe some of the question later.
Introduce yourself.
Yeah.
Okay. Should
Who
I?
you are.
Okay. Well, I'll stand up as well. Hello, my name is Matilda. I just started the Master Studies in Migration Studies here. And thank you for a very interesting talk. I was just wondering on this, there was this one subject you talked about, shifting geography labels. I don't remember the exact word, but you talked about how the division of developed, underdeveloped, global south, global north, how these use of these terms have different meanings. I appreciated that because I've always wondered what am I supposed to use when I write my papers, and I wondered if you have any recommendations for migration students looking for the right labels to use in our papers when we divide the word. If you have any thoughts on what is most appropriate to use in our study field. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, excellent question. Some other, a third one, and then we can give the room to Lucy. A third one? Don't be shy, I think you have a lot to say.
Hello, I'm Rahel. I'm also studying migration studies. My question goes in a similar direction. If you have any recommendations for methodologically decolonizing our studies. If there are works that you can recommend, and yeah, thank you.
Okay,
you want to react?
Yeah, if you want to ask Lucy, and then we will recollect more questions. Yeah, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you for those questions. And it's, yeah, with these online talks, it's always really strange and you don't know if anyone can hear you when you're speaking and you can't see the audience. So it's good to hear that you've been engaging and thinking with what I've been presenting. So I guess the first comment, and I didn't catch the name of the professor who asked the question, but you ask, I suppose there were two things in there. One about if the function of borders hasn't changed much, and you kind of saying but it's intensified in the present. And then a second question about how do you then make a political critique once you recognize something is long-standing. So I suppose on the first point, for me, I think the idea isn't to say that that everything that happens today is literally the same and as in a period of colonialism, and we need to find kind of equivalent examples. It's to draw connections between, draw and identify connections between things that have happened and also the logics underpinning them. And we can recognize that at particular points in history, these kinds of logics of border enclosure and violence and encampment and all of these things and exclusionary pieces of legislation, at some moments in history, they are more or less intense. And we can think of periods in the past when they were more intense or less intense, but the point isn't really to reach a kind of simple conclusion that either it's more or it's less. It's to be thinking about the present with the past, I guess. That's the way I think about it. And then in relation to how do you make a political critique once you recognize that something's long-standing? Well, I think I don't have like a beautifully thought through answer to this question, but off the top of my head, I think I don't know how we develop a political critique of something without understanding it properly. And I don't think that we can understand the kinds of violent borders that we're witnessing now without having a really thorough understanding of the kinds of logics that enable those kinds of processes. And I think when we start to recognize those logics, we see the ways in which they are connected to other injustices that we observe within our societies of police violence or brutality, of discriminations or racism, or the level of international development. And I think that the power is in being able to make those connections and understand them on a deeper level, and then be able to articulate them with others in relation to claims for social justice, not simply to say, this is really long-standing, and so things can never change. Like, we've got to understand them properly in order to imagine futures, but we have to continue imagining that things will get better. And there are aspects of the world that aren't worse than the past, I'm sure. I can't think of any right now, but I'm sure that there are many aspects. And in relation to Matilda's question about labels, so I suppose the first thing to say about that is the point I was really trying to make is that we need to be aware that these labels are socially constructed labels, that the labels are also political. So if somebody says, I'm from the global south, they're making a kind of political claim or statement, but it's quite different from saying, I'm from Damascus, or somewhere you literally have community connections and ties to. So I think it's just about recognizing that the meanings that those labels have are connected to the statement you're making in that moment, and to kind of understand the politics of that. But it doesn't mean that you then, having recognized that I think sometimes the kind of politics of language and labels can be paralyzing for people, and can kind of, you can become so distracted wondering what term you should use that you then don't say anything. And so I think in my own work, I've read a lot of work in third world approaches to international law. It's often called TWAIL, and they use the words first world, second world, third world in a kind of, because while those labels have been quite discredited, they argue that they're not trying to hide something like developed and developing, or global south or global north is. But I think really, if I were you, I would use whatever labels you want to use, but explain and justify, or rather recognize the limitations and the kind of histories of those labels that you're using, or the imperfectness, because we have to use language to communicate. So many of the words that we use are imperfect, and it's just about kind of recognizing that, nevertheless, having acknowledged that kind of imperfection and potential problematic aspect, that we need to go on and develop our arguments and our work. And Rahel at the end, who was asking about methodology, I mean, I think probably maybe if you email me, I could send you some recommendations. Like, there is a literature on methodology. The most famous kind of decolonizing methodology kind of literature has come from indigenous scholars, particularly in places like the US, Canada, Australia, who are frustrated with being researched upon, and wanting to kind of reclaim the terms of that. But there's also some interesting kind of emerging literature on the kinds of relations within research, where, for example, local researchers are hired and used and not named in research and things like this. I think for the purposes of a kind of piece of student research, where some of those kinds of critiques don't apply in the same way, because it's not about kind of building a team, it's you doing something. I think it's about being alive to and sensitive to the power relations of the research that you're engaged in, and reflecting on some of the questions that you might want to ask. I always think try and find out what the powerful are thinking and trying to do, is always a good direction if you're not part of a community that you might be doing research with yourself, because you often have limited amounts of time as a student. If in doubt, go for the powerful and try and find out what they're doing and thinking. There isn't enough attention on the powerful, I don't think.
Thank you. So I think we can launch second round of questions. See one end here, there in the middle, and then at the end. We can start here.
Okay. Thank you, Lucy, for sharing your expertise with us today. I think it was a really interesting topic, and of course of a lot of importance these days. I'm not sure exactly how I want to phrase the question, but I'm particularly interested in climate migration, and I think it'd be something like, do you think, is it likely that the current climate crisis or climate change is able to overturn or to reinforce existing colonial orders, or also the conceptions that the way we think of race and modernity, and so migration as well? Because personally, I only know of a particular period in history, which is in the 17th century, where I think there was a similar climate crisis or a global warming period. And I think it had some sort of an impact. Well, of course, it caused some social distress because of the droughts and etc. that happened. So if you have any insights on that, I'll appreciate it. Thank you.
Hi, thanks, Lucy, for your talk. My name is Kamei. I'm a graduate student in migration studies from the University of Copenhagen. I have two questions. And the second kind of presumes the first, but I don't want you to take it that way. The first question is really about your researcher intent, or your personal interest and objective and motivation behind writing this book in particular. And then the second question, so there's been other discussions about bridging the gap between the migration scholarship and the race scholarship. Other universities have been doing lecture series on this as well, and I'm wondering if you can speak a little bit more to why there is a gap between the two scholarships, and how we can go about filling it, if you agree that there is actually still a gap. Thanks. Who was the third?
Yes. Thank you. Yes, hi Lucy, and hi everyone. I'd like to start by introducing myself. My name is Senja Hellgren. I'm a senior scholar and lecturer here at GRITIM. So I will hopefully meet most of you at my course, Diversity, Discrimination and Citizenship. And now I would like to ask Lucy, I'm very interested myself in the relationship between research and activism. And I am curious to hear more about to what extent do you perceive that your research is controversial in the UK context? Now thinking about parallels, for example, to the context in France. Also here in Spain, we have at least a political context in which colonialism is highly contested still now, and there are discussions that search every now and then about whether we should, Spain should apologize, for example, to the colonized nations, and that is very much criticized by mainly the political right now. At universities, there may be more consensus about the view, but still, it's not a non-controversial issue, right? And I can also draw parallels to my own experience. I come from Stockholm University in Sweden originally, and I conducted research on structural racism, structural discrimination there in 2005, 2006. That was very hard to talk about. And it's still not non-controversial either. So I deal much with this issue, how to transmit your research when it's perhaps not even accepted conceptually at your own university. So I wonder if you have had any experiences of this. Thank you.
Thank you, Zenia. Okay, we do a 3-question packet.
Okay, Lucy, if you want to answer, the floor is yours.
Thank you for those questions. You have such wonderful, engaged students. You're really lucky. So the question on climate migration, I mean, it sounded, I'm sorry I didn't catch your name from the first student. It sounds like you probably know more and have more ideas about this question than I do, and perhaps more expertise having looked into it. And it would, I don't know how possible it is across this medium, but it'd be interesting to hear your thoughts on this. I think as somebody who is not an expert in climate migration and has not kind of researched that in depth myself beyond teaching in my own university, I think it seems at the current moment that tackling climate change is not in the kind of discourse or development of, I don't know, emergent, whether are we tackling climate change, I don't know, the emergent discourse of tackling climate change, that it's not clear that these kinds of the legacies of colonial relations are being undone or dismantled. That's not apparent to me. Obviously, the discourse of global environmental justice has started to become a kind of more central to activism, and I think that is rhetorically at least entering into some of the things that powerful politicians are saying, but it's in the same kind of mode of development, like we'll pay you some money to not have coal-fired power stations or adapt to the consequences. I from this moment, I'm not hopeful that that climate change itself will and the kind of tackling climate change will overcome these kinds of ideas of colonial modernity. And I think in the case of climate migration, it's so if forced migrations now, the situation we're in now, where if somebody has been forced to migrate, even if they are able, if they kind of, a person on the street would assume that the case that they have would straightforwardly constitute persecution under the Refugee Convention, states find ways to exclude them and to prevent them from having that, the kind of, often people struggle to make those claims. I think the likelihood of large-scale population movements as a consequence of climate change then being leading to a shift is less likely than a kind of consolidation of the logic of closing people out, actually. But yeah, as I say, I would like to hear your ideas about that. Definitely, if you wanted to share that. And then in relation to the second speaker from Copenhagen, again, I thought that you had a really interesting point, and that like I kind of was wondering as you were speaking if there were ideas that you have that would be really fruitful to hear about. I think I talked a little bit about the intent behind the book at the beginning, which relates to the first question. I guess so. And it also kind of relates to the next speaker's question about whether it's kind of political to talk about colonialism, I guess. But so my own research is about asylum, and when I was doing my PhD research in kind of 2008, 9, 10, and it was about how we can understand Britain's policies in relation to people seeking asylum in the context of the country's colonial history, I would tell people and they would be like, what? Colonialism? Like, what are you talking about? Just seemed completely like a bonkers crazy. And I was like often told I was indulging in a kind of like strange theoretical obsession when there were much more important things, real things going on. And I was kind of messing around with history and theory. But even though then in the years that went by, I was surprised and pleased to see like the kind of topic of thinking about like contemporary society in the context of colonialism in the UK, but also in other European countries, seemed to, in a range of different areas, seem to become, something that was of interest, not dismissed as just kind of stupid and boring, something that was potentially interesting. And then obviously we've had this period where this discourse of decolonizing has become popularized. But in spite of all that, there continued to be a really sort of just curious thing going on with migration studies, where I would just go to conferences in the UK and in other European countries, and everybody would be white. Nobody would be, I would look through the abstracts. There would be like one paper out of 250 which even mentioned race, no papers that mentioned colonialism. It's just very curious and strange, and this is like a really obvious way of understanding what's happening in our world. You know, in Brexit, in the context of Brexit and everything in Britain, and all of the racism and things that have been going on, kind of brought to the fore in the public consciousness, I guess. So there's that thing of observing that and sort of thinking I won't go to migration studies conferences because I'm not sure that that's kind of intellectually fruitful for me. But then also, and you know, I work in sociology, and so there are a lot of sociologists of race and ethnicity, and going to lots of exciting and interesting talks about theorizing race and racism in society and policing and other areas. But then also, yeah, just because of my work on asylum, just constantly getting emails and people coming up to me and asking me for reading lists and literatures and asking me about it. And so I kind of just wanted to put something into the world to kind of make an intervention to say, you know, these are all these amazing scholars, and they can really help us think about these questions that we would want to ask. So like, hey, like, here's a discussion of lots of their work, and perhaps now it's all here. Could we talk kind of, I don't know, there's no excuse not to cite them or something like that, or to engage with it. And so I don't know why or how that's happened. People have said to me that they think perhaps migration studies has been scared of suggesting, like, if they talk about racism, then they make it seem like racism is, like, race is real or something like that, like legitimizing racial science or something. That's something that somebody suggested to me. Yeah, I'm not sure, and I don't know if on a recorded thing can say more about that. But again, it would be interesting to hear your reflections on this, and perhaps from the position of Copenhagen and Denmark particularly. Then in relation to, is this controversial in the UK? Yeah, so I think it's fair to say, so in the UK, children don't learn about the British Empire in school, even though it's like the largest kind of chunk of British history, really. It's like the main thing, if you think about it. They don't learn anything about that, and the only sort of place to learn about that for many years has been like period dramas on the TV with kind of people in nice dresses frolicking about and things. And so there is a general public amnesia and ignorance of anything to do with colonialism. But in the past few years, and particularly in the wake of Black Lives Matter and a range of protests and things that have been going on, there have been growing calls to recognize the role that colonialism has played in shaping our country, shaping our lives, and how we experience the world and imagine the world, and how our streets are labeled, and what our like population is like, and how we kind of have lots of money for country houses, and just all of the kind of the ways in which colonialism has shaped the country in all sorts of different aspects. And I think it's fair to say that there's been a significant backlash against that, and a great hostility from the government to that kind of agenda. So I suppose potentially the work that I do is controversial, but I'm not really interested in. I don't know. I'm not really focused on that, on either being controversial or pushing back against those kinds of things. I'm like interested in doing the work and having the interesting conversations, and less interested in what like Boris Johnson thinks than other people, researchers, activists, friends, or the work that people are doing, and trying to think and understand and think about change, I guess. And, you know, obviously I'm in a privileged position. I'm a citizen, and I'm white, and I have a job in a university. So, you know, the danger for me is not significant in the way it would be for other people. So I guess that's then your duty to like do something.
Okay, thank you very much. I think we still have some minutes, just a very quick round of 2, maybe 3 questions, but very quick, please.
Maybe we can do the last one.
Yeah, we have the first one here.
So 2
there.
and 3.
Someone
Who's
more?
the third? 3. Okay.
Okay.
Hi, I'm Ruby. I'm from Sheffield. I'm from the UK. So I'm just interested to know, like, building on the ideas of Brexit in the UK, do you sort of, I mean, in my opinion, I sort of feel like the narrative of, like, anger with migration and, like, wanting to refuse entry into the UK, and like the fueled fire of like the politics behind that, it's quite like, I don't know, I just feel like we've regressed a little bit with British sort of narrative, and it's just interesting to know the relation of colonialism with that, and how, you know, our like, you know, we're living in contemporary society and we're still like angry with migration. It's just, and we're quite racially divided as a society in England. I don't know, I'm just interested in the development of like colonialism with that.
Hi, I'm Roos, and I'm also studying migration studies. And I think my question relates a little bit to the question of Rael, but I was quite interested in how did you find your sources for your book about colonialism, because I had one course like 2 years ago about colonialism, and all the sources came from the Netherlands or, I don't know, Germany. So they were all written by white people from Europe again. So I was wondering, how did you get all your information and everything? Because I think that's quite important as well. So that's my question.
Hi, my name is Natalia. I'm also a student, a grad student in migration studies, and I have a question. I think you already addressed it, kind of, sort of, but I would like for you to elaborate a bit more on how would you address the issue of positionality as a white person researching on and writing on racism and racial structures, and yeah, how you would go about it. Thank you.
Okay, Lucy, you have the floor.
Thank you. Thanks so much. Okay, so Ruby from Sheffield, which is, you know, always nice to hear people from Sheffield. So Brexit and the relationship to colonialism. So I think that Brexit is very much about the end of empire playing itself out in Britain. We had a period of decolonization, of losing the empire, and shortly after or in the middle of that joined the European Union. So we've never really been an island nation or four nations set kind of apart and relatively powerless in the world. And I think that Britain struggles with that kind of crisis. And I think, as Gurminder Bambre has written a lot about the way in which Britain struggled with being in the EU, because it was meant to be one amongst equals, whereas it wanted to be in charge of an empire kind of thing. So I think that Brexit is deeply tied to the legacies of colonialism. And I think in relation to anti-migrant sentiment, I mean, there's a lot to be said about that, but I guess it comes from, like, in part from the talk and the book, and the work of all the people that we cite in it, thinking about why would it be, like, obviously not all people in Britain hate migrants, and, you know, many people are migrants themselves who live in Britain. So why would it be that there would be a portion of people who would be so responsive to the distraction of blaming people who are migrants for problems that we have in our country? And I think the kind of ideological and semantic architecture is all there to be primed to do that. The second question, how did we find our sources? So I guess we've been doing this work for a number of years, for quite a long time, and are networked with a lot of people, not obviously within migration studies, but around the world, doing work on these kinds of themes that we've met at conferences and books we've read. And so we both started from the ideas and literatures that we knew and were interested in, and then also got in touch with people in different locations who we knew were doing really interesting work and would know about literatures that we might not have come across on a particular subject if it wasn't our area, and just kind of talked and discussed with them about anyone's work that they would recommend. And, you know, we read a huge amount also of new work, and I guess it's through speaking with people and having friends around the place. And we would definitely, I think, kind of language is always then a limitation, and there's all kinds of structural things which I know that you will know, because there is a lot written about it in relation to who publishes and where, in what ways. And so obviously we were sensitive to that, but also at times constrained by it. We had some things translated or those kinds of things. So I guess we didn't find sources in one way, we found sources in lots of ways, and also we'd been doing that work for a long time as well, and so would our kind of colleagues and friends in different locations. So kind of, yeah, it's collective drawing on expertise. And then in relation to Natalia's project, I guess in relation to positionality, so my own kind of empirical work is about understanding the kind of asylum policies that Britain has. So my research focus, I guess, is on understanding how are these things done in our name? How do these ideas come to dominate our society? And so I'm interested in understanding, like, initially power in Britain and kind of the kind of structural, the way that society is structured. So I see this kind of the policy context of asylum and borders not as something that is separate from me and my life and my privilege as a white person, but something that is integral to all of our experience in the world and systematically disadvantages people, and is done to some extent in my name in some way to theoretically protect me or something. And so I kind of come at it primarily wanting, like in my work, which is focused really on asylum and refugee policy in Britain, to kind of trying to understand that context and kind of speaking with politicians and looking at like kind of lots of documents and things, to be understanding those things rather than, I guess, primarily working on or kind of researching a community outside of myself or that I don't identify with or something, I guess. So that's been the kind of focus, and I guess that's what I meant earlier when I was saying, you know, focusing on the powerful, and then I was talking in my talk about the kind of the level of the structural. That's the kind of questions that I'm interested in exploring in my own work.
Okay, thank you very much. I think the time is over. I don't use my privileged power as a chair in order to share a question with you, but I will share it by email. So.
Okay, yeah, that's fine. And yeah, I would welcome if, you know, such interesting questions and your students are so engaged in everything. You know, if anybody wanted to email me to ask anything, then you're very welcome.
Okay, thank you very much for this very stimulating presentation. Thank you very much to you, Lucy, and we hope to see you soon in person here. And thank you very much also to all participants and their comments and questions. Thank you.